This is Spiritual Mommas Podcast. We're a couple of mamas out here just trying to raise kids, make it through a workday, and navigate mental health, all while going through a spiritual awakening. And we thought we'd take you with us. So grab your favorite cozy drink and let's chat.
Hello.
I'm Aericka.
And I'm Kim.
And this is Spiritual Mommas Podcast.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, welcome back. So, how are you today, Miss Kim?
I'm doing okay. I know that we talked about this like over the weekend and stuff. I've been having some weird dreams. But actually last night I had weird dreams, but nothing that was like, significant or crazy. So it felt like a much calmer night.
Much better.
Yes. And I went to bed later than I normally do, but I still woke up feeling rested. So that was nice.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. A nice shift in my nightly experience.
Yeah, that's good. That's better.
How have you been?
I actually had a dream that I divorced my husband. That was fun.
Okay.
But yeah, we're over it. So, we made up. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I'm actually better than I've been in a while. And I know like every week we've come on here and I'm like, oh, I'm discombobulated. I'm this, that, and the other. And I feel crappy. But I think I figured out why.
Okay.
And I think it's because like my doing and my being energies were out of alignment. I was doing. Like I was kind of like getting back into that like forcing things and like just being very like do basically and being less of that like let me just see what happens, let me just flow with this. And once I kind of figured that out, I got like pulled it all kind of back and was doing specific meditations for it and really trying to be a little bit more grounded, and I think that has helped.
Yeah. I wonder at what point that becomes like really just a natural experience, because it like just trying to balance those two things, because it can be so easy in other ways to kind of fall back into things that and routines, and when you're so used to just doing, it can be hard to just be for a minute.
Yeah, it was interesting like that I could tell I was more anxious and I was more like keyed up, and it's like when you're more balanced, like that's not happening. So it's like, okay, cool. Figured it out. Get on it. Let's do it. No, I was kidding.
Yeah. It's also nice too when you can like recognize that that's what's going on, as opposed to like, I've felt off for 3 weeks and I have no idea why, but you start to notice like, oh, I have more anxiety, or I'm noticing these specific sensations, or I recognize that this is a little bit more challenging for me. So,
yeah. So I figured it out. So I'm back
Good.
to it. I'm feeling much better. So
amazing. And
I wrote what I think was a beautiful grounding meditation for the weekend. So if you haven't listened to it, I do recommend it. I liked doing it. I thought it helped me just to like do it. It helped me to write it. So it can help you guys too.
I love that you're doing that. I save them for specific times.
Well, yeah, I mean, do it.
I'm like, okay, I really want to get some like grounding right now, so let me set this time aside. And they're short, they're quick, 10 minute. It's perfect. Yeah. Perfect. So
yeah, this one was I don't know. I'm very connected to this one. I liked it. So
good. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So today we're gonna get into what may be considered a heavy topic. Talking about some different cultural rituals for death, grieving, the whole experience. So
yeah, I don't know why we decided to do this, but it just kind of decided. We were both like, yeah, let's just do this. I don't know. I wonder what was just kind of, someone needs to hear this, I think.
I agree. I also think, it flows really nicely with a lot of the things that we talk about as far as like finding practices that are your own, feeling connected to it. the ones that I am going to cover today, and I know that we're both going to cover different ones, the ones that I'm going to cover today are very much rooted in like original practices, ancient practices, indigenous practices. And you can see how sometimes those maybe specific rituals or things may get lost over time, but people still feel connected to the experiences. And so maybe this is a great way of exploring like what things resonate with, whether we're talking about loss, grief, death, dying, in that aspect specifically, or other areas of your life.
Yeah, I mean, I think we both have talked about kind of like not connecting with religion per se right now. And I think a lot of, well, what I think of when it comes to funerals is very religious. So this will be kind of interesting to see what's not our rooted in religion traditions, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I'll jump in a minute, but a lot of what I found was a mix. There's a mix of, these are things that have, you know, practices that have always been around, and also there's religious tones to it, which isn't a bad thing, right? I mean, following what you're connected to and what you believe in, I think is super important, but recognizing how there can be a flow between the two. It doesn't have to look just one way. So
yeah, definitely.
All right, so I'm going to jump in. I did a couple different areas. So I was looking for Latin American traditions at first, and that's such a large population. And even within certain areas, like I'll talk about Brazil, I'll talk about Mexico, even within Brazil, even within Mexico, even within any of these places, there can be a lot of variation. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail as like, you know, this is for all of Brazil, but I am going to talk about specific places. I'm going to start with Mexico because I think a lot of people are familiar with Dia de los Muertos. So that happens at the end of October, beginning of November for a lot of Mexican culture, and that is really a way of commemorating deceased loved ones. Up to, I think last year, I always thought it was just November 2nd, and I learned that it's actually not just November 2nd. Okay. So it starts earlier in the week, and depending on who you're commemorating, and you could be talking about pets, you can be talking about aunts and uncles, you can be talking about adults, you could be talking about kids, you can be talking about, you know, whoever. Depending on who you're commemorating, that will determine what day you are commemorating them on.
Okay.
So.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So that may shift too based on the region that you're in and things like that. But I always thought it was just a beautiful thing to say, this time of year, we're going to collectively come together and, you know, honor our loved ones who have passed on. And one of the things that I really wanted to highlight, and we've talked a little bit about this before, but in Latin America and in a lot of the world, it's very much a collectivistic culture. So the good of the group is held to a higher standard than the good of the individual. And this can be seen when we're talking about the death process, the dying process. This can be seen very specifically in how decisions are made. If you are part of this culture and you want a specific thing done, it doesn't necessarily mean that that will be done, because how is that going to affect everyone?
Right.
So it's something to keep in mind, that there are some differences based on, you know, the culture and the way that you're looking at it. And it's also that and I think this is in a lot of places, getting old, dying, grieving isn't necessarily talked about ahead of time. It's not necessarily discussed as like, hey, this is something that we need to prepare for. It's kind of like, when we're in it, and we'll take it from there. And then some other things to consider too with Latin American culture, specifically in Mexican culture, is that there is a a hierarchy and authority that is recognized. So very much an important aspect of the culture is, if it's, let's say, grandma is passing, who's going to be making those decisions? Well, who's the next in line? Who's the person who holds the authority? That may look traditional, like, okay, the head of the household is the man, the oldest man in the house, or something like that. Or it may be something that is still considered traditional, but looked at more by title, who has the highest title in the home, whether that's through education or employment or status in some way. So one of the things that I found that I could easily relate to with this, because this is something very similar to what I've experienced in my family and culture, but the wake that you have before the person passes can be, or when they pass, can be days long. I have experienced in some ways at some times that like the wake can be a couple hours on one day. That's not how my family does it. And that's not traditionally how it happens in Mexican culture or Latin America. So my grandma passed away earlier this year, and it was I don't know if I want to say that it was unexpected. She was old. She was like 92. But she had been doing okay up till that point, so it was kind of a little unexpected.
Yeah, a little sudden.
Yeah. She became ill, and within a couple days she had passed. And when that happened, there wasn't a lot of time for everybody to come together. Generally, what they do for my culture in Puerto Rico, it would have been like 2 full days of a wake. But because it was not a lot of time for people to come together, and because they wanted to kind of get things moving, they just did 1 full day. And 1 full day, I tell you, my mother was there at the funeral home from like 9 a.m. until like 9 p.m.
Wow.
Like a whole day for...
Yeah, that's like a whole day.
Yes, everyone to come together. So
now is this... Are people generally like the body laid out, or is there like cremation, or is there like a specific typically what you would have?
Yeah, so it can look different again, like, based on where you're at. So I'm going to walk away from what my family has done and go back to the what I have seen for what I've researched for Mexican culture. So the wake can be days long, and whether or not the body is laid out depends on the specific region that you're looking at. Some people, depending on their beliefs, and sometimes religion plays a role in this, if they are pulling in a Catholic religion base or a Christian religion base, they're not doing cremation.
Right.
So the body will be laid out. And everybody can come, pay their respects, say their goodbyes, express their gratitude. They come together, they share memories, they play games. There's a lot of laughter. There's a lot of celebration of life. If the religious piece is not necessarily a part, that's where you might see more of cremation. And so the body will be cremated, but there will be still people gathering together to commemorate them. So it could be a couple days, it could be like 1 or 2 days, it could be like a week, depending on how significant this person was, what type of role they had in their society, in their community, with the people around them. And then after that wake, there's a funeral that's held. The procession for this funeral is where the community comes together. So the wake may be more for immediate family. It may be more for people who knew that person specifically, whereas the funeral procession is for everyone. Everyone in the neighborhood, everyone in the community can join the procession and bring that deceased person to their final resting spot. It can be common to have people throw in dirt into the grave to have final words spoken. And then maybe some religious traditions come in here where prayers are said. There may be mass held on specific days for this person. In the article that I read for this specific culture, they had mentioned having mass held like on day 1, day 9, and then like a year later. So they are very mindful of the timing of it all and what it means. And then there's also the after effect of, okay, what happens after this person has been laid to rest? In this culture, there is this idea that you must regularly visit the gravesite to keep that connection with that person. So for the first year, it may be every month, and then every year on the anniversary and also on Dia de los Muertos. So those are some things to be mindful of when, you know, you might be visiting people who have family members who have passed, and, you know, what is it that they're experiencing and all of that. So like I had mentioned that it's specific days for specific people to come back. November 1st, the belief is that the souls of children who have passed will come back and visit. November 2nd is adults who have passed will come back and visit. And traditionally there are altars set up, which can be set up, from my understanding, they can be up all year, but the actual, the other pieces that come into play and the actual honoring of them may look different the rest of the year, where on these days it looks very specific. So the altars may be set up with their pictures. On these days specifically, there's going to be food on those altars, their favorite foods, things like that. There's going to be maybe their favorite games or their favorite music is going to be played. There's going to be their favorite flowers so that they can smell that and come back home.
I love that.
It's a way of guiding them back to the home to be connected with their family.
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty cool. I really think it's a beautiful way to kind of honor those that have passed.
Very much so.
There was some similarities, but not very many when it came to some of the other places that I looked up. And so this one indigenous tribe in Brazil, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce this, but I think it's Xingu. It's Xingu.
Okay.
And this tribe in Brazil engages in several rituals, which I thought was a great way of keeping that original indigenous connection alive. So some of the things that they do is that, and I was looking at photos of this happening. They have this massive tree trunk, and we took down a tree in our yard once and had the tree trunk kind of just like laying there, and we had to cut it up ourselves. They're not that simple to be like carrying around.
Yeah, exactly. They're a little heavy.
Yeah. So the men in the tribe will all come together and carry the tree trunk. They will decorate it to represent the person who has recently passed, or if multiple people have passed, they will decorate it to represent all of the people that have passed.
Is it a specific kind of tree, or it's like just a tree in the area?
I don't know. I didn't get any clarity on that. And I wasn't looking for that specifically, but it did note that the tree trunk would be decorated by in ways that represent each person. So I'm not sure if it's something that's already in the area or a specific kind of tree trunk, but it gets decorated and then they all carry it together. And the men play a really big role in all of these traditions. So the men are the one who are carrying it and who are helping to decorate it. They will traditionally smoke herbs and gather fish. And they do this in a way that is very traditional to their heritage and ancestors. So this isn't necessarily like, hey, I'm going to go fishing with my fishing pole. It's like, hey, let's put the net out there. Let's all get in the water. Let's grab these fish. And then the women's role is more supportive. So after the men have grabbed the fish, the women are going to carry the fish to the site where they're going to be cooking them. When I saw the pictures of this happening, it's like 300 fish.
Oh, wow.
Like they're getting as many fish as they possibly can. The entire tribe, there's multiple tribes that can participate in this. So if it's a person that's very significant in the tribe, you're more likely to see all of the tribes come together. So yeah, it's a lot of work that goes into it, and then they cook them all and get to partake in that together. So again, we're talking about like coming together, gathering, eating food. There is traditional music that's played using traditional indigenous instruments, specific type of dancing that happens. And in this tribe, they wrap everything up with an exhibition of fights. So it's mixed martial art combat, but it's not like a fight that you're watching to, who's going to win. It's more like a let's show off our talents.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
So they will get in their traditional attire, whether that's body paint or feathers or, using specific types of weapons or things like that. And then the competition happens, and there's also a fire ritual. And most of that is engaged with by the men in the tribe.
Very interesting. Very cool.
Yeah. So the parts that I found that were like really similar there were like the gathering together, the food, the music, holding to the traditions that way. But then obviously there's some very big differences too. I wasn't very clear on this Brazilian tribe, if it's something that happens over days or if it's something that happens in a day, or how much time it takes. Yeah. So I wonder what that would look like.
Yeah, I mean, if it's happening in a day, that's a lot. Probably goes like, if it were, it would probably go overnight, like for 24 hours or whatever.
Yeah, I would imagine that some of it needs to have like preparation or be done on different days. Like gathering, like fishing for that many fish is not something that happens in a short period of time. So I would imagine that's something that takes a little bit more time. So then I wanted to go to a different part of the world. So I tried to look up some different African traditions for passing, and I couldn't find as much, which was kind of disappointing. And maybe I wasn't looking in the right places. But
there's a lot of tribes, though,
Yeah.
A lot of different.
Yeah.
A lot.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's so many different things that can go into this. So what I did find, I used this one source, which was a person's personal experience. He and his family was from the Congo, and although they had moved to other parts of the world, they came back together to celebrate the passing of his grandma, to celebrate her life. So I used that for a reference, and I think there was some really beautiful things in there. One of the things that I liked, so he mentions that it's common when a person dies of old age to celebrate their life. And one way to do that is in what you wear. So you'll see that if it's a funeral or funeral services, everybody's going to be wearing white. And that is to represent life, which is like a nice, bright way of kind of bringing up the mood, which, I think is a beautiful thing to do. And similar to what we talked about before, there's 2 days of a wake, and then the final day is the burial and celebration. So it's a 3-day process in total. The way that he mentions it in the article is that day 1 is everybody gathering together, cooking, laughing, sharing stories, things like that. And maybe immediate family is coming to see the body. The body is laid out in a room, a much smaller room. Day 2 is where immediate, intimate, close families may come. It's a small viewing space, so everybody's not coming together. It's, a couple people at a time. Day 3 is the burial. So that is when the body is moved to a much larger space, and everyone, all of family, community, friends, everyone comes together. They will sing, they will dance, they will express gratitude. Something very beautiful that he mentioned in the article was that they were literally going to, one by one, going up to the body and saying thank you for, something specific that person had provided for them.
That's nice.
Yeah. So I thought that was really nice. And then Another area that I had looked up in Africa was in Kenya. And again, even within Kenya, there's so many different cultures. So I looked for this one specific group, the Luhya people. And I apologize again if I didn't say that correctly. It's Luhya. I really need to learn how to say these things. But they have a lot of traditions that go into this process before, during, and after. So I'm not going to go over all of them, but some of the big things that stuck out. They do try to preserve the body. They put it in wet sand, charcoal. They do traditional things like wrapping the body in animal skin before placing it in the casket. A child's funeral will take 3 days. An adult's funeral will take a week. It's expected for people to camp out at the home of the deceased person to support the family during that time. Okay. It's expected for people to be openly crying, weeping, sobbing as a show of their love. Something that they mentioned in this article, and I don't know if anything was missed in translation. The article that I read was in English, but it was a traditional media source from Kenya. So I don't know if anything has been messed up in translation, but something that they mentioned is that the showing of love, the crying, the weeping is a community experience. So everybody's expected to do that. Mm-hmm. If you have beef with your neighbor is not going to do that. They're not going to participate. They're not going to cry. They're not going to show their love, their support, or anything. And that's
There's drama, but
yeah. It's like, oh, if we're not okay, you're not allowed to come in and support us in this or be part of this. So it also kind of shows, coming back to that collectivistic view, you can very much tell then when people aren't on the same page. Whereas here, in the United States, we're very individualistic. I'm not going to expect my neighbor to come to grandma's funeral, right? Whereas
to put on blast that that you weren't friends with those particular people.
Oh, did you see Mary didn't come? Oh, all right. Something's going on there. Some of the other things that they mentioned is that the mourning period is expected to be for a specific period of time. So if a woman is mourning her husband, she's expected to mourn him for 6 months and mourn him openly. So every day at 6 a.m., she needs to be seen crying. Every day at 5 p.m., she needs to be seen crying. Until that 6-month period of time comes, at which point her husband should visit her in a dream to let her know it's okay to stop.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So there's this tie-in that, again, this connection to your loved ones, even after they pass, there's going to be some sort of communication, connection, honoring that person.
Yeah. During the Victorian age, that was kind of a thing. The widows were supposed to be dressed a certain way and act a certain way after the passing, and if you didn't, it was just it was suspicious.
I've heard of that before, and it's okay, so you have to have your own personal experience, and it's something that you may be expected to share with others, whether it's something that you're doing for others to see or something that you're sharing with others on a one-on-one basis. But this recognition that, this life has come to an end and you need to honor that and acknowledge that in some way. So some of the other things that they mentioned is that there may be specific positions. So if a person is of high status in the community, then they may be buried sitting on a chair, sitting up, or specific places, if they're buried in their front yard, it's going to be this corner if they were this type of person, or that corner if they were that type of person. And then specific memorial services that are set up after. So there's a wake that takes a couple days. There's a burial and a celebration that takes a couple days. And then at some point after all of that has been done, maybe months later, they have specific memorial services to commemorate that person. So it's an ongoing process. It's not just this one day or 1 week or something like that.
Yeah, I had not heard of other culture. I mean, I haven't researched that many cultures, but I have not heard of that, like where you are buried and how you're like positioned.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I had not heard that before.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things that I didn't get into, but that they talk about in this article, and the link will be in the show notes so you can look into it if you want. But some of the other things is like, if you're buried at night, what does that mean? And if you're buried in this way, what does that mean? So they have a lot of significance to the process, every single step and what it means and how it needs to look. Nice. So, and then the last place that I looked up was Australia. And I think again, just like more interesting information about how people honor their loved ones who have passed. So just some of the things that stuck out to me about what some of the cultures in Australia do. When a person passes, you cannot speak their name and you cannot show their picture. And the idea is that it will disturb their spirit from passing on. It will keep them here if you use their name. So depending on where you are in the culture, some places will make exceptions under certain circumstances or will allow you to use a substitute name. And they have some very common substitute names. So if you hear this name, you know that the person is referring to somebody who has passed. Okay. The verbiage that they use, the terminology that they use for a period of mourning is sorry business. So if somebody says, I have sorry business to attend to, that means that they are in mourning or that they're doing some part of that process of mourning. And there is this community sense where the community will come together and grieve together. There's a very high expectation that this happens to the point that, like, okay, if grandma has passed and I have already started the grieving process, but I know family's coming in from out of town. I could be in the middle of cooking a meal for family to come out of town. The second that I know that they're here, I have to stop what I'm doing and go greet them because we are now in this together. Oh, okay. So it's expected that whatever you're doing, it doesn't matter what it is. You're going to drop it immediately. You're going to go to the family and come together to share in that grieving process. And some of the expectations are that there's going to be storytelling, a lot of oral traditions where things are going to be passed down from the person who has been deceased to the people who are coming to grieve. And this can last from days to weeks to months. One of the things that I thought was really beautiful about what they said was that they own their grieving process. They know that that is a part of life. So it is not something that's hidden. It's not something that's overlooked. It's not something that's pushed down. If they are in their grieving process, they're there. Some of the Aboriginals who engage in these practices will recognize that, okay, this grieving process is going to take however long it takes. So they are allowed to not engage with daily activity. They don't have to go to school. They don't have to go to work. They don't have to do anything for however long this process takes. Oh, that's nice. The only exception to that is if they're receiving state funding for whatever, then they have a certain amount of time before that doesn't apply anymore. But yeah, it's a very much owning that as part of life, as part of the life cycle.
I like that because I feel like, at least in some Western cultures, and maybe it's just a person to person or family to family, but I feel like grieving is like, okay, you lost this person, okay, you should be better in a lot of instances. And it doesn't look like that. It's not linear, it's a very individualistic process. It circles around, and some days you're good, some days you're bad. So I like that they actually give you and expect you to go through that process. Yeah,
I agree with that. And I think the other thing too is, like, because it's not a linear process and because you can't ever, know, like, okay, tomorrow I'm going to be 100% better. In all of these cultures, they're giving you specific activities you can do to acknowledge the loss and the grief and all of that, which I feel like is missing sometimes in Western culture. Like when I go to, okay, we can have a wake and a funeral, and usually it's we're having a wake on one day, we're having the funeral the next day, and then that's it.
Right.
There's not a lot of tradition. There's not a lot of action to, like, what do I do with all this grief? Who do I talk to about it? What do I,
now what?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I just have to figure out how to keep going, so.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the theme that I'm seeing in this is that a lot of it's community based.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm gonna talk about 3 different cultures if I have time here, and it's all like very community based. Mm-hmm. In most of them, except for one of mine, is there's like that wake process.
Okay.
So let's go. I'm going to go to Southeast Asia, specifically Laos, and let's see. So they're traditionally Buddhist. It's a specific type of Buddhism. Mm-hmm. It is Theravada Buddhism.
Okay.
So it's deeply rooted in that type of religion, and also like animist and ancestor worship traditions. Mm-hmm. So the Laotion people, the Southeast Asian, which is like Cambodian, Thailand, Burma, those type of countries, that they see death as a transition, not an end.
Yeah.
And it depends on the deceased's karma determining their next like rebirth. And death is part of the cycle of samsara, which is birth, death, and rebirth.
Okay.
So, yeah. And again, the karma. And what family members have to do once you pass is that they have to help you, what they call merit make. So they're offering food and prayers and donations to the monks on behalf of the dead, so that this transfers merit to help the deceased move toward a better rebirth. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And cremation is typically what happens, because fire represents purification and releases the soul.
Okay.
So in some cultures, burial is practiced, but not typically. And also if there's sudden or violent death, it requires like special rituals because it prevents the spirit from lingering. Mm-hmm. There's also where at some point, like when they lift up the casket, they turn the chairs upside down so that the spirit can't sit there and linger. Mm-hmm. It's very much like you don't want the ghost to linger. So there is the name for the ghost is P.
Okay.
I'm sure I'm saying this wrong. I asked my husband how to say it. He was like, it's P. I'm like, okay, I'm sure. But it's they're restless ghosts who have unresolved karma. And then there's also specific P ghosts, which are called P pret, which are hungry ghosts. And they may wander if they were greedy or cruel in life. So they do special ceremonies to appease these spirits and prevent them from haunting.
Interesting.
So typically after somebody dies, there's that wake. Like it's usually like kind of like a week long. The person will stay in the home. It's usually in the home, and the family will attend to them, and they will the family will come through, bring food, bring specifically rice. Is very big in the culture. They'll bring like offerings, different like incense, stuff like that to the family. And then when it's time, they will do a big procession all through the streets for the community. They carry, now this is obviously in Laos, like in the United States, it's probably not as big, but, and then they will carry it to a specific place. And when they get there, they will actually like light it on fire. Okay. Then the ashes will be buried. And then they, back in the home with the family members, they'll do what's called a basi ceremony. And this basi ceremony is actually, they do it in a lot of different aspects of life. They do it for marriages. They do it for what would be the equivalent of a baptism. They do it if someone's been sick. And what it is that you pray over the person, the monks come and they do chants, and then they tie strings around your wrists as they pray with you, and it's to bring the spirits back to you. It's to tie your spirits back to you. So they do that so that like your spirits aren't wandering, and that other spirit can like go off to the afterlife. So it's a really cool ceremony. We had one for our wedding.
You did?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had it in the Lao wedding. We did. Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very pretty. And typically the family will wear white, because it's like in a lot of other cultures, white is considered like for death and like purification. Yeah. Like a lot of other cultures don't wear white for their weddings. Mm-hmm. Like Indian ceremonies, they don't wear white. Laotion, they don't wear white. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. And they can typically mourn at a 100-day ceremony, which is often held to honor the deceased and ensure their smooth passage to the next life. And then they also have a festival of the dead as well, which is called Bun Kao Padaptin. I know I did not say that correctly. And then families will make food offerings to the monks and leave food for the wandering spirits. So. Okay.
So there's some similarities and definitely some differences, but.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the, like, kind of the whole tradition is that the whole rituals and everything is they don't want the spirits to linger because they don't want them to haunt you. And they also want to have them be able to rebirth, to have them come back as a different entity. So, they don't want that to not happen.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to ask if that has to do with, like, getting stuck. If they don't do these ceremonies or rituals.
Yeah, and then that can cause somebody illness. It can cause somebody, like the people that they're haunting, it can cause illness and misfortune. So that was that one. Well, so some similarities, but not the same.
Yeah. I think a lot of the similarities that I'm seeing so far have to do with like the collectivistic viewpoint of, everybody has a role to play or come together to share this.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I did one for Celtic specific, kind of like Scottish, because I'm of Scottish descent. I'm Scottish and Eastern European.
Okay.
So, and this is kind of like more ancient Celtic traditions, like 15th century, and this is more in the Highlands. So you have the Highlands and the Lowlands. They have slightly different culture, but this is from the Highlands, which is like what my family is from. So in Scotland, death is something that's foretold. There is always supposed to be a sign pointing to someone's demise. So death is never a surprise, according to legend. And there's a number of common symbols and images that present themselves before the person's dying. And it depends on where you live in Scotland, depends on the myth. But apparently one of the most well-known death messengers is similar to the Grim Reaper, except for it's an old woman, and she's known as the washer at the ford. And this story dates back to the 15th century. And supposedly a washerwoman poses at the side of a river or streams, and she's washing the stains from the clothes of those who fought and died in battle.
Oh.
So once you spot this washerwoman, death is happening. Now, apparently you could trick this person. But once you see her, you're on your it's happening.
Okay.
So, and there's still a lot of folklore around that. So, like if you see strange lights or if there's an unexpected knock on the door, it means something's happening. And they very much believe in a good death, which I've seen a lot of cultures, like there's good deaths and there's bad deaths. And usually a good death would be one in like battle. So obviously we're not all battling. So but this is back in the 15th century. And a bad death would be an unexpected death, especially away from the home. Like if it happened far away, that was not good.
Yeah.
So if to die on a journey was not good either. So at the moment of death, the windows were opened so that the spirit could go away. A lot of cultures are like, don't let the spirits linger. However, in Mexico, they're like, nope, let the spirits linger.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. A lot of the cultures that I've seen are like, no, we don't want spirits around.
Yeah.
So you want the soul to go away, and then you immediately close it because you don't want to come back.
Mm-hmm.
And mirrors in the house were covered or had their faces turned towards the wall, and all the clocks in the house were stopped to prevent confusing the ghost as it tries to leave. Because it doesn't want to like go through a mirror because it's it'll confuse it. So and then there was typically,
that's interesting.
Yeah, typically there would be a bell ring. So there was a specific person in the town that was called the bell ringer, and they would stand in the town square and ring the bell and then announce the person that had died. So, and that also served as an invitation for the entire community to now attend the feast and funeral at the home. So then the women of the family would wash the body. It was called the kistain, and it would to purify the soul. And then they would dress it in dead clothes, more commonly known as winding sheets. And then they would lay the body in the coffin. And typically they would wait for usually a week. And usually that's because back in the day, we couldn't tell if people were actually dead or not. So they would have this wait to make sure that nobody woke back up.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where a lot of at least a lot of the Western culture weight comes from, is literally because they wanted to make sure that people wouldn't. There was a point in history, like the 18th century, where this was happening so often.
Oh my goodness.
That they were putting bells outside of the grave sites. So when somebody woke up and clawed their way back out, they could ring the bell.
That's wild.
Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So there's a ton of celebration, talking about happy memories. And they have a big processional similar to like they do probably in Mexico and then the Laotion. And it said often that there would be where people would have drunk so much prior during the wake that they would actually drop the casket or lose it or get in fights with other clans that were coming to the same funeral home.
Oh my goodness.
I thought that was funny. Funny, but not funny. And then they would share whiskey and so they would just pay respects. Oh, the other thing is when it left the funeral home, the coffin was carried through the house with the last thing to leave was the feet.
Okay.
No, the casket leaves the house feet first so that the soul cannot find its way back home.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was kind of the main... Yeah, I mean, there's lots of singing and lots of food, lots of celebration.
Yeah. It makes me think of how we have like superstitions. And if things like that is how it started, because there's a lot of ideas about what happens to the soul and where does it go and how do you get it there and the things that you need to do. And if you don't do them, what happens? And I don't know why. I mean, I think across all of the ones that we've talked about so far, there is that to some extent. But for some reason here, I'm like, oh, superstitions. Okay. Like opening the windows and then closing them right away, turning the mirrors around, turning the clocks off and things like that. With like the Mexican culture, they want to stay connected with the spirits. They do want them to go so that they can like pass on.
Yeah, and have a good passed on life.
Yes, but it's always about like, how do we stay connected and come back to? How do you know how to find your way home? And in here, it's like, no, we have to make sure that they can go.
Yeah, they cannot come back.
Yeah.
We do not want them haunting us. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I feel like we're going to kind of learn some of this we're going to talk about the spring equinox and some of these other, in another episode. And it's interesting. I feel like a lot of our superstitions come from like the Celtic and like the Germanic tribes.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's why that is, but I feel like a lot of them come from that. At least one, maybe I know more of them because that's what I came from or what, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know, well, maybe superstitions could be a whole nother thing, but a whole nother episode. But I know of some superstitions that are, you know, very like culturally based in different places. But just as you're saying it, I'm like, I've heard of something like that being a superstition before.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So the last one I have is it's from the Navajo tradition.
Okay.
And theirs is a little bit different than all the other ones, I feel like, because it's less about community.
Okay.
And a lot of it has to do with, you know, the restless spirits, very similar to some of the other ones here. But they believe that when a person dies, their soul separates into two parts.
Okay.
And one part returns to the universe in harmony, and the other, called the chindi, may linger as a ghostly presence, carrying the deceased's unfinished business, anger, or misfortune. So avoiding death is how you maintain the balance. So it's seen as a natural process, but it's a very disruptive process. And they don't dwell on death or speak excessively about it, as doing so could invite misfortune. And traditionally, a dying person was taken away from the home to pass in a more isolating setting. And if someone does die inside the home, they would have to abandon the dwelling or like very much cleanse it, because the presence of death could bring that misfortune and illness. So if a person did die inside the home, it was abandoned or burned to prevent spirits from lingering. And even in some modern day traditions, they also still like very much purify it. So it ensured that the chindi did not attach itself to the living.
Interesting.
So, there was minimal contact with the dead. Family members do not typically touch or prepare the body themselves. There's usually a specific person designated to do that. And it's typically buried very quickly. There's no wake. There's no like family coming to see them or anything like that. And it's typically before sunset on the day of the death or very soon after. And they're placed in remote areas and marked very discreetly, sometimes not even marked, to prevent the spirits from hanging out there. So, and then the personal belongings were often buried with them or possibly burned so that they're not looking for their possessions. And they don't really, like I said, they discourage prolonged grieving to prevent the chindi from lingering. They often avoid speaking the name of the deceased after the burial, similar to the Australian tribe, I think you were saying. And there's no memorial service or anniversaries for the dead. So
interesting. I think that's I don't know how to put this into words, but I think what's interesting about that is that there's a piece of it that is very much like in harmony, in balance. This part of the soul returns to earth and returns to, you know, nature and spirit and continues to be part, but also recognizing there's this other piece that almost everybody as humans can connect with and know that we have like resentment or holding on to these negative things or things that are holding us down. And that's the piece that they want to resolve as quickly as possible. That is unavoidable. So let's put it to rest as quickly as we can and walk away from it so it doesn't attach itself to anybody else.
Yep. So if you were close to the deceased or handled the body, you had to undergo a cleansing ritual to remove the presence of the death. And that was usually with a sweat lodge or smudging with sacred herbs like sage or juniper to help restore your spiritual balance.
Yeah. That reminds me of, and I don't know much about this, but I've heard about this before, like the sin eater, who in some cultures will be called to a person who has passed to absorb their sins so that it's not something that is brought with them into the afterlife or whatever comes next, or that it's not something that is just lingering.
Yeah, so they have something similar in that they're concerned that if this chindi is hanging out and is very restless, it could be used for bad things.
Mm-hmm.
So like witches or
Mm-hmm.
bad practitioners can take these spirits, or demons can take these spirits that are kind of restless and not passed into the afterlife,
Mm-hmm.
and use them for bad things, like skinwalkers and these other bad like things. So they very much don't want you to be hanging out.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they don't have a lot of depictions of death either, like not a lot of artistic stuff about it. There's not a lot of ceremonial representation, like skeletons, ghosts, or spirits of the dead, like put in pictures. Yeah, I thought that was just really interesting.
Yeah.
And usually, so the idea is that when you are sick or you're passing, you know this, and you can call in the spirits to come and help you pass peacefully into the next life, or whatever they believe. I'm not sure what the belief is, but back into nature, and pass peacefully, and like your ancestors and other spirits come to lead you in that process. But if you die suddenly, or like in an accident, or by murder, or something that just like takes you out, you didn't have time to call those spirits in. The spirits didn't know that was happening, and that's when you run the risk of being a chindi, and they have to do very specific rituals to call in those spirits to make sure that they can come get you, and they know that you passed. So
yeah. The other thing that I'm thinking about that isn't necessarily expressly said in all of these cultures, but can be inferred to some extent, and in some cases it is expressly said, but what happens after? There is something that is happening after. There is something that is going to allow this person's soul to continue on in some way, in a way that you can still be connected to it.
Yeah. One of the things is that I think it's like World War II, or I'm not sure, some of the older wars, they had a lot of problem with the Native Americans who were overseas or in battle and died, and then they couldn't perform their rituals, and so there was a lot of grief and angst about that, and the government had to figure out how to help with that. So that was a really kind of tough time with that. So, but
I could imagine that would be. I mean, not being able to perform the ceremonies and rituals that you are expected to do, and then knowing that, there can be this part of that spirit that is now unattended.
Right. Yeah. So the final one is very interesting. It's very specific to certain types of cultures, and it's very out there. I've never had heard about until more recently, and they're called sky burials.
Okay.
And it's typically, they're Tibetans, people that do this, and it's very detailed, and there's a lot of sacred preparations. The kind of the long and short of it is there's specific places that when you die, you are taken by the Roigapas, is a person who then takes the body up to a specific or very remote area of the mountain, and they actually take apart the body. They dismember the body in very specific ways. And the act is believed to help the soul leave the physical form. And then the body is then fed upon by vultures, who are considered very sacred. And the idea is that then they can take this back to feed themselves, feed the earth. Their body feeds the earth. And like, it's this whole like process of nature and living and dying. And so I found that fascinating. And there's a couple of different tribes that do this, but it could take several hours to do the ritual. It's very solemn. It's filled with a lot of chants and just sitting with nature. But it's like very much the sacredness of living with the earth. And the Tibetan practice emphasizes the transmigration or rebirth aspect of the Buddhist doctrine. And according to this belief, the soul's journey through different states of existence continues based on karma. And we already talked about that. So the sky burials serve dual purpose, honoring the deceased and adhering to the compassionate, environmentally conscious tradition that aligns with core Buddhist values. So
fascinating.
When I saw that, because it sounds, from a Westerner, it sounds almost atrocious. It sounds like, oh my God, you're just leaving a body on the side of a mountain. But when you look at like the whole process, it's not them just leaving a body on the side of the mountain. It's very sacred. It's very solemn. It's the person who is doing this dismemberment is praying over them and love and blessings. And it's not at all like a gross thing. Yeah. And then to have a sacred animal come and take you, essentially, it's very physically take you. It's very actually kind of beautiful if you think about it.
Yeah. From that regards, it's very ceremonial. There's a lot of purpose. And it's very much in line with like the cycle of everything. Right? You are coming into this life, you live your life, you finish your life, you are returned to the earth, your spirit is able to move on. So there's a lot of that makes a lot of sense. And I don't even know that I necessarily think that it's like, I don't know what the right word is, but shocking. I think that's the word I would use. That was my initial thought, but I think it's only the initial thought. Once you like pause for a second and let that sink in, it's, a very natural process. Yeah.
Yeah. And especially in that area, doing an actual physical earth burial is very impractical because it's a mountain. It's, it's very rocky. Yeah. There's just isn't a lot of terrain for that. So they also do like a water burial. That's another tradition that is where they will sink the body. They also do an air where they burn the body, but really the sky burial is the most traditional.
Yeah. It's pretty interesting when you start to learn like all these different things. And in the research that I was doing, there was so many things that popped up that I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that was a thing, or wow, that seems really interesting, or wow, that seems like something that would make a lot of sense, or so many different traditions.
I just love the kind of the Buddhist thought process on like that cycle of life and the process of coming back and being a good person and what that does for you and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And when you're thinking about like the collective, and I don't mean that in the sense of like collectivistic cultures, but like the people on earth, the collective, the people who leave this earth, leave the physical form, do still contribute in some way, or can still contribute if there are those of us that are trying to access them or connect with them. So making sure that process is as smooth as possible or done in an appropriate way based on whatever the culture beliefs are is super important. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
Well, I hope everybody learned something. I definitely did. It's interesting to me how like across the world there is essentially a theme, you know what I mean? Like mostly a theme, or at least like pockets of the world have similar themes, and but it's all it's all reverence for the dead in a certain way. So
honoring them, celebrating the life that they've had, the contributions that they've made, connecting with them afterwards, making sure that it's not something that is forgotten. Yeah, I can see that. I wonder if anybody has any of their own personal stories that they wouldn't mind sharing, that are connected to specific rituals or traditions that are important to them.
Yeah, I'd love to hear like what different people do. So.
Yeah, let us know. Or if there's anything that resonated with you that you think you want to learn more about, or see if there's a way to incorporate in your own practices.
Yeah, definitely. Let us know and like us and rate us and follow us, and we'll see you next time.
Until next time. Bye.
Bye.